everyone. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Miss Arena, and I am our Seneca Intermediate librarian for this school year. And today I'm here to start a read aloud. This is going to be a 5-part read aloud on a new story that we just received from our Scholastic funds. Really quickly, I wanted to say thank you to everyone who was able to order from our book fair. Every single time that somebody places an order, a proceed of those orders go right directly back to our school, and we're able to order more books for our students to enjoy and to just grow that love for reading. So today, since it's December 3rd, I decided that a good story that we can use is A Christmas Carol, but this is actually based off the novel by Charles Dickens. This one is a retelling by Geronimo Stilton. So it's going to be a 5-part read aloud. So stay with us over these next few days, school days, and I'm going to post a new section each time. So this book was written, it's geared at our 4th through 7th graders, but the whole family can enjoy it. So let's get started. Part 1. Ebenezer Scrooge. There was no doubt about it. Jacob Marley had passed on to a better place. The documents had been signed by the doctor, his assistant, the funeral director, and by Ebenezer Scrooge. When Scrooge signed something, that made it official. Scrooge had been Marley's business partner, the executor of his will, and the mouse's only heir. Now, you might be thinking Scrooge was feeling sad about the loss of his business partner, but Marley had been quite old and he had been sick. So while Scrooge certainly wasn't happy to be attending a funeral, he had more important things on his mind, such as his business. You might be surprised by this coldness, but for Ebenezer Scrooge, business came before everything and every mouse. The first business decision Scrooge made after Marley's death related to the sign outside of his office. It read, Scrooge and Marley, and Scrooge decided it would stay that way. But it wasn't out of respect for the memory of his long-lost friend. No, it was because the business was known by that name. Scrooge might lose money if he changed the company's name and his clients didn't recognize the business. The one thing Scrooge loved more than anything else was money. No one in London knew more about scrimping to save a penny than that old cheapskate mouse. His heart was as hard as steel, and he was as miserably crabby and closed up as an oyster trying to keep its precious pearl to itself. The chill inside Scrooge froze his snout into a scowl, made his lips pucker into a pout, and sharpened his already pointy nose. His head and eyebrows were covered in hairs as white as a layer of frost, and his whiskers and beard were as prickly as a row of icicles. Scrooge managed to spread a chill everywhere he went, even in a room warmed by a crackling fire. Everyone who approached him felt it and took a step back, shivering and pulling their sweaters tightly around them. Inside Scrooge's office, it was the worst since Scrooge spent every hour of every day there, even holidays. It was practically a freezer. That's because Scrooge was too cheap to spend any of his money on heating coals to warm the room. Out on the street, it was the same. No one stopped Scrooge to say hello, not even so much as to wave his way. Beggars never asked him for a single cent. They seemed to know he would never, ever part with a single dime. Even dogs tugged at their leashes and dragged their owners away when they saw Scrooge coming. But did Ebenezer Scrooge care? No, not at all. He was perfectly content to be left alone in his office, where he spent hours counting and double counting his gold. In fact, he preferred it this way. 7 years passed after the death of Scrooge's business partner, Jacob Marley. They were 7 lonely years, but Scrooge didn't mind at all as his piles of gold continued to grow. Life for Scrooge was very simple until one cold December, when something very unexpected happened. Ah, humbug. It was the most wonderful day of the year, Christmas Eve. Scrooge was working in his office. It was terribly cold, and outside the air was crisp and the street was thick with fog. Mice were rushing along the road, clapping their paws together to keep warm and stamping their boots on the ground to keep them from freezing. The town clock had struck 3 in the afternoon, but it was already dark outside. Inside buildings and homes around London, candles flickered, but the fog seemed to slip in through every crack and keyhole. It was as if the fog didn't want to stay out in the cold and couldn't wait to warm up in the front of a nice warm fireplace. The door to Scrooge's office was open so that he could keep an eye on his sole employee, Bob Cratchit. Young Cratchit was working in the front room, which was really more of a closet. It was a real hole in the wall. At that moment, poor Bob Cratchit was busy copying some letters. The fire in the hearth was barely an ember, and Cratchit had a big white scarf wrapped around his neck in an attempt to keep himself from freezing. He had to stop writing from time to time to blow on his paws to warm them. Scrooge's assistant knew better than to use more than 1 or 2 pieces of coal. Here's a picture of Bob Cratchit working with Mr. Scrooge. In the stove, and he only added extra fuel to the fire when his fur was almost frozen. Scrooge always took advantage of him, but Cratchit never complained. It was partly because Cratchit was poor and needed the job, and partly because he had a kind and gentle nature. Bob Cratchit was truly a good soul. "Merry Christmas, Uncle!" a happy voice shouted from the entryway. A tall, stout young mouse came into the room. His eyes were bright and his cheeks red, and his smile warm enough to cheer anyone up. Well, anyone except Scrooge, that is. "Bah, humbug!" Scrooge muttered. "Humbug, Uncle," his nephew replied. "Aren't you happy it's Christmas Eve?" Scrooge sneered again, and his thick eyebrows untied his forehead. "Happy, happy, blah!" squeaked Scrooge. "What right do you have to be happy, as poor as you are? Aren't you poor enough to be sad?" His nephew, who was named Fred, just smiled. "Come, come, Uncle. What about you?" he replied. "What right do you have to be angry? Aren't you rich enough to be happy?" "Rich? Me? Rich?" Scrooge replied, scandalized. "What do you mean, rich? I may have money, but I also have too much to do. It's especially bad at Christmas. When the year is ending, I have so much work to do, squaring away the accounts. Christmas isn't a happy time. It's just another hassle." Okay, his nephew gave in. "I won't change your mind, but I do want to celebrate. Uncle, I came here to invite you to lunch tomorrow at our house, seeing as you're always alone on Christmas. Will you come?" "Lunch on Christmas Day?" Scrooge gasped. "Bah, humbug! I can't get away." "Okay," Fred said with a shrug. "Happy holidays anyway, dear uncle, and don't work too much." With that, Fred closed the door and disappeared into the fog. The office quickly seemed even colder and darker than before. Here's a little close-up of the picture. The next chapter is A Simple Request. Scrooge went back to his work grumbling. He was so busy he didn't realize Bob Cratchit had just let 2 gentle mice into the office. Scrooge noticed them only when they were right in front of him. He eyed them warily, as if they were 2 criminals who had just escaped from prison. Good day, Mr. Marley," the first mouse greeted him, warmly. "You're Marley of Scrooge and Marley, correct?" "Marley has been dead for 7 years," Scrooge corrected the mouse grumpily. "He died on this very day, Christmas Eve." The gentle mice blushed and exchanged a nervous look. My apologies," the first mouse replied. "Then you must be Mr. Scrooge," the second mouse jumped in. "Surely your generosity must be equal to that of the dearly departed partner, Mr. Marley." And the word generosity, Scrooge's eyes widened, and he flinched as if he had been stuck in a pin. Since it is Christmas, Mr. Scrooge, it's always good to think of the needy, the first mouse went on, turning over his hat in his paws. Yes, the poor, the sick, the homeless, the second mouse chimed in. Scrooge raised an eyebrow. Tell me, gentle mice, are there still shelters in this town? Yes, of course. There are, but stuttered the first mouse. And are there hospitals and nursing homes? Scrooge pressed on. Why, yes, there are, many, the second mouse exclaimed in surprise. Scrooge gave one of his rare smiles. Oh, wonderful, then. I was afraid I'd have to donate money from my own pocket in order to cover the expenses of the poor, the sick, and the homeless. But I am so pleased that London's civic institutions are still functioning perfectly. Now, if you will excuse me, gentle mice, I have work to do. Good day. The two mice quickly found themselves back out in the cold, squeakless. No handouts. Cheered by the fact that he had ended the conversation without shelling out a single cent, Scrooge went back to work. Outside, the darkness grew even deeper. The fog was so thick it seemed you could cut it like a knife through soft cheese. The carriages moved down the street at a snail's pace, and the cold was so intense that it seemed to bite one's cheeks. Inside Scrooge's office, it was finally closing time. This was always a sad time of the day for Scrooge, as he knew he wouldn't have anything to do at home. Bob Cratchit, on the other paw, couldn't wait to get home. He knew his family was waiting for him so they could begin their Christmas Eve supper. Cratchit snuffed out his candle and raced to put on his cap. Then he wrapped his white scarf more tightly around his neck, as he couldn't afford an overcoat. Scrooge spotted him out of the corner of his eyes and scowled. Hm, he grumbled. I imagine tomorrow you'll want to stay home all day, Cratchit. The poor mouse blushed. Oh, well, actually, yes, sir, he squeaked. It is Christmas, after all. You don't need to remind me, the old mouse growled. What could you have to celebrate when you can earn so little and have a family to take care of? But Bob Cratchit just smiled. Don't say that, Mr. Scrooge, he replied. I have plenty to celebrate, and it's just one day at home. Well, you better be here at dawn the next day, Scrooge snapped. And you'll be docked pay, understand? There are no handouts. Here at Scrooge and Marley. Bob Cratchit agreed, then raced out of the office door in the blink of an eye. He hurried down the street, his big white scarf waving in the fog like a flag. He couldn't wait to get home to play with his children and celebrate a joyful Christmas Eve. Marley's Ghost. By the time Scrooge turned onto his own street, the lights from the shops were already out. He noticed the signs up and down the street were decorated with branches of green holly and red berries. Lights, colors, decorations. Bah! Scrooge muttered, shaking his head in dismay. What a waste! A sweet-looking mouselet stood on the corner, singing Christmas carols and holding out a basket for coins. Scrooge passed by, ignoring him. Scrooge shuffled along slowly, leaning on his walking stick and taking care not to slip on the icy street. He stopped to eat dinner at his usual shabby tavern, and after reading all the newspapers, he finally headed home. To save money on rent, Scrooge lived in the house that had belonged to his partner, Jacob Marley. The dark, cold rooms were so gloomy, no one would have wanted to live there. No one except Scrooge, that is. The old mouse knew the way there like the back of his paw, but that evening the fog was thicker than usual. It took some effort for Scrooge to find his own front door. When Scrooge finally made it home, he looked up at the front door in astonishment. The door knocker had suddenly turned into a snout. How could that be? Scrooge rubbed his eyes in disbelief. It wasn't just an illusion. The knocker definitely was a snout. Jacob Marley's snout, to be precise. It stared at Scrooge wide-eyed, its fiery red hair floating above it, as if it had been ruffled by a breath of warm air. As Scrooge stared in disbelief, Marley's snout vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Disturbed, the old mouse rushed in to turn the key in the lock. Scrooge stepped inside, his heart beating in his ears and his head spinning. He quickly shut the door behind him, double checking that it was locked. Scrooge took a deep breath. He had to calm down. He lit the candles in the entryway and began to climb the stairs slowly, taking them one by one. At one point, he almost lost his balance, and the candlestick dripped wax on his foot, burning his paw. Here's a close up so you can see the snout. Ouch! Scrooge cried, out in his surprise. His legs trembled as he checked every room in the house, the sitting room, the bedroom, the closet. Everything seemed to be in its place. What nonsense, Scrooge thought. I must be seeing things. There's nothing to be afraid of. He put on his nightshirt, sleeping cap, and slippers and settled into his armchair in the front of the tiny and not very warm fire. He had barely rested his head on the back of the chair when he realized that the bell, which had been used to call the servants in former days, was ringing softly. Scrooge jumped up in surprise, and the bell got louder and louder, and then stopped abruptly. A second later, he heard another sound, a deep metallic clanging, as if someone was dragging a heavy chain up the stairs. Scrooge gulped. Could it be a ghost? No, of course not, Scrooge thought. Ghosts don't exist. Yet the sound grew even louder until it was just a few steps away. Bang! The bedroom door flew open. For the second time that evening, Scrooge found himself snout to snout with Jacob Marley. This time, though, it wasn't just a vision, it was a real ghost. Why are you in chains? Scrooge took in the familiar snout, the waistcoat, the stockings, and the shoes. It was really Marley. His body was so transparent that Scrooge could see right through him to the pair of buttons that decorated the back of his jacket. Marley was wrapped up in a long, heavy chain that wound around his body like a steel snake with a tail. But it wasn't a normal chain. Padlocks, chests, keys, and account books all dangled from the chain, dragging Marley down. They were all items the business mouse had used frequently when he was alive. Scrooge couldn't believe his eyes. What do you want from me? He asked the ghost, trying not to be too rude. Ah, many things, was the reply. It was even Marley's voice. Who are you? Scrooge stuttered, cold, sweat dripping from his brow. Who was I, you mean? The ghost corrected him. Don't you recognize me? We were partners for years. It's me, Jacob Marley. Can you sit down? Scrooge asked. I can, the ghost replied, and he settled his transparent body into the chair facing Scrooge. The fur, the tails of his jacket, and the ribbons on the ghost's clothing were constantly moving, as if a gentle breeze were blowing all around him. You don't believe I'm here, do you? He asked. Scrooge shrugged. Why should I? Surely you're just in my imagination. Actually, Scrooge had no idea what to think. He was terrified, but he was trying his best to remain calm. The sound of the ghost's voice was enough to scare the fur off his tail. Why are you all chained up? Scrooge asked, staring at the strange change with horror and curiosity. I built this chain myself throughout my life, Marley's ghost explained, a sad look on his snout. I welded it ring by ring, piece by piece. Now all it does is weigh me down. Do you want to see it up close? Scrooge trembled fearfully. Or maybe you're curious about your own chain, the ghost continued. I can tell you that when I died 7 years ago, your chain was already long and heavy, as mine is now. But since you've worked hard to make yourself even richer, right? Scrooge looked around in an alarm as if he expected to see 50 or 60 feet iron and padlocks wrapped around his tail. But there was nothing there. Jacob, please give me some words of comfort, Scrooge begged. You're scaring me. The ghost shook his head. I'm sorry, Ebenezer, but that's not possible. I'm not in a position to comfort anyone. In fact, I can't stay much longer. I have to get back to the office. My heart has always been chained to work, and so that's where I must stay for all eternity. With that, Marley's ghost cried out, shaking his chains and wringing his paws. He seemed so distraught that Scrooge felt his heart ache for his old friend. Why do you suffer so? Scrooge asked. You were such a great business mouse. Why aren't you a satisfied ghost? Business, Marley's ghost repeated, raising his eyes to the sky. That's the problem. Friends, affection, family. These should have been my business. My dealings were but a drop of water in the ocean of truly important things. Oh, if I had been less selfish. He lifted the chains as if they were the cause of his pain, and then dropped them to the ground again sadly. Every year at Christmas, the weight of these chains becomes unbearable, Marley's ghost confessed. They remind me of when I last left the office alive on Christmas Eve and walked with my head down, not caring about anything or anyone. Scrooge saw himself closing the office door earlier that evening and felt a deep sense of regret. But you still have a chance, the ghost said. Tonight you will be visited by 3 ghosts. Scrooge's hopes crumbled. 3 ghosts? Is this my only hope? He replied. The first will arrive at 1 o'clock. Marley's ghost continued. The rest will follow. Pay attention, Scrooge. Listen to what they tell you. And now, if you will excuse me, I must go. Marley's ghost rose from the chair, floated over to the window, and pulled it open. An icy chill invaded the room. Curious, Scrooge walked over and saw an impressive sight. A stream of ghosts floated by outside. One old, one young, and one tall, and one short. They were all as transparent as the air around them. Marley's ghost slipped in among them and drifted off into the night. Remember what I told you, Scrooge, he called out. Remember! Then the parade of ghosts disappeared, swallowed up by the fog. Scrooge closed the window and he hugged his arms around his chest. He was confused, shocked, and exhausted. Unsure of what else to do, he put out his candle, climbed into his bed, and fell asleep. And that is where we're going to end part 1. I hope you've enjoyed it so far. I love that it's a retelling of the famous Charles Dickens novel, and we will continue on with part 2 tomorrow. Thank you to all of our listeners, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.